Hello and welcome to this episode of TheSquare. I'm Poonam Schallenberger and I'm here with Samantha Flores, director of Hugo. Welcome, Samantha.
Thanks, Poonam.
So glad you're here today. We're talking a little bit about data-driven design and how it shapes the user experience in the built environment. Specifically, this conversation kind of started because you just ran a project with Ontario International Airport. Can you tell me about why they came to you and what the sort of ask was when it came to doing a little bit of design research and data?
Yeah, for sure. So Ontario International Airport, they came to us because they have a very small airport. It sometimes is used by people who maybe can't find flights out of LAX that are desirable, or, the surrounding Inland Empire comes to Ontario International. And it's an older airport. They've actually just developed their customer experience team. So their customer experience team came to us and just wanted to know, how do we actually elevate the customer experience? I mean, in their mind, it was, people want more outlets or people need comfier seats, but they really wanted to drill down to, where do we actually put dedicated investment? And they wanted a data-driven solution so that they could go back and say, hey, look, we've looked at all of the data, we've talked to all of the passengers, and this is where we should actually put our investment.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When we think about designing a space like an airport, there's obviously the technical operations that have to happen there, right? Certain number of planes that need to move through or passengers that need to move through a space within a certain time. But then there's the actual experience of things. How do you define a customer experience even to begin with?
It's really interesting because I feel like, especially in aviation and in other projects as well, or other typologies, but in aviation, you can have one interaction in an airport and it ruins your entire experience. I mean, think about if you go to the front door at the curbside and you think it's just going to open and you're standing there waiting for it to open automatically. That can ruin your experience.
Right.
Going through TSA can ruin somebody's experience. I mean, I feel like we've all probably had
or
experiences.
Airports just tend to
You're so stressed.
Yeah.
You have so much anxiety.
You're already sort of vulnerable, right? And then they get you. It's like you walk in, the gate's all the way on the other side of the terminal and you're lugging all of your things. So,
or you go to the other end of the terminal, you get to your gate, you realize it's a little bit delayed, you have time for food, but you actually can't see anything within the vicinity. So you don't want to leave your gate in case the time changes again, so you actually don't participate, so you have a bad experience.
Right. And all of those friction points are probably different depending on what kind of traveler you are.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So can you walk me through a little bit of the data process and why even go to data? And what does it sort of tell us about the passenger experience?
Yeah, so I think when people hear like customer experience, passenger experience, user experience, they think that there's a lot of feelings and emotions and preferences, and especially people who are investing money in something, they don't want to invest money on someone's happiness level or satisfaction level to a point where they want to make sure that they're making an investment that's going to pay off, right? And so when we think about the user experience and how we can go to a data-driven approach, one of the things that we did specifically in this project is we interviewed 90 passengers. 90 passengers, some of those who had just recently come through Ontario, some of those who had been through Ontario in the last 5 months, some of those that lived near Ontario, some of those who have been through LA and Ontario. So we did a variety of passengers. Not only that, we actually kind of dug into the demographics of who actually goes through Ontario and made sure that our sample size reflected that demographic.
Yeah, I love how you said that. When you're making this investment, there's so many, even beyond airports, right? When we talk about office spaces or schools or any sort of typology, there's this understanding of like, well, I don't like this, so this must not work, or this is what causes frustration for me. And it's such a subjective thing.
It is.
And when you're making this investment for now, but also for decades and years to come, for all for a diverse set of users.
Right.
I can't think of a space that invites such a diverse user set as airports.
Oh, right. And then on top of that, we're not just looking at the passengers, right? Because like you're just saying, passengers will tell you what they like and they dislike. Someone may love the water refilling station.
Right.
And what does that tell us? So we interviewed 90 passengers. We also followed 80 different passengers across the airport to understand their behavior in space.
What do you mean follow? Like
Not
stalk
creepy.
them? Okay.
Well, we just, we jotted down what they were doing.
Oh, okay. So actually,
yeah, we saw some people actually praying in the terminal. We saw some people dancing, like doing a dance class in the terminal. Like we documented a lot of different behaviors on how they actually use space. We noticed that in hold lounges, everybody was crowding around tables and surfaces, and no one was actually sitting in the bar seat. So that was helpful for us to understand, if we're starting to change the makeup of the hold lounge, we might want to introduce more surfaces. But on top of interviewing passengers and following them around and tracking their behaviors, we also did retina scanning glasses to physically track data points. We got almost 5,000 different data points from those scanning glasses.
Can you tell me about what are retina scanning glasses? I mean, I think it's sort of self-explanatory, but
yeah, so what we did, we got about 20 passengers that had never been to Ontario before, and we gave them customer experience tasks. So things like, you found a lost package in the hold lounge. Find lost and found. Find where you need to drop this off. We told one passenger, you are a passenger with reduced mobility, so you cannot use typical conveyance. You need to use elevators. So in all of your, moving through the airport, you need to be using elevators. Or, we had one passenger that we labeled her as anxiety driven, and so she had a pet that was with her. So she had to find pet relief station and then had to find a place in the hold lounge for her and her pet. So what we did was we gave them these scenarios that they had to run down. They had never been to the airport before. And then we used retina scanning goggles. So these goggles or these glasses, they scan your retinas at the base, and then they have a camera in the middle. So everything that you're seeing, we can see. And then the scanners actually help us locate fixation points. So if we tell you to go find pet relief station, you may be looking for the signage. And what we noticed on that specific task is that this person was looking, or this set of people that had this task were looking for the dog symbol, but were ignoring the language that said pet relief. Yeah. So they weren't able to find the location. In addition to the fact that you have to do a 180 to find it, which is challenging for passengers who are wayfinding. So we ran through several of those tasks. The retina scanners actually give us fixation points. They give us distances and time on task, if they completed, if they failed. So it really helps us to understand how people are being successful throughout their time in the airport, especially on tasks where we're asking them to find a concession that can allow for people with reduced mobility.
It's just wild because, I mean, going back to what we were talking about before, just it can be such a subjective thing. Be like, okay, I got it. This is where I would normally look. But perhaps someone can't lift their head as high. Right. And their fixation points might be a little bit lower. Or like you mentioned, they may not speak the same language. Airports obviously invite people from all parts of the world. And so maybe they're not looking at the language. They're looking at these icons instead. Right. Okay, so we're tracking people at the airport. We're asking people to complete surveys. We're doing some data, like retina scanning. What's the purpose of collecting all of this, and what do you do with this data?
So we actually go through a process of collecting secondary data first, which is looking at everything that's out there and existing. So we did a social media scan, and we found all of the customer experience related comments that are out there on the internet, free for access, so that we could understand how passengers who aren't specifically being asked by us researchers about their experience, how their unfiltered responses are.
And so this is like tracking people's tweets and comments.
Yeah, tweets, comments, Instagram posts, anything. We can track anything in the social media scan. And then we also looked at Google reviews. How are people reviewing different spaces within the terminal? So we're getting all of that data. We're also gathering data as far as their passenger demographics. So that's all secondary. And then when we do primary data gathering, that means that we are gathering data that is purely from our studies. So that's back to the interviews, the survey taking, following passengers around, behavior mapping, spatial syntax in the space.
What is spatial syntax?
It's an algorithm and basically a script that we run on the floor plan where we can say, okay, this is a typical passenger flow. If you look at a floor plan, passengers should do this or they should do this. But with spatial syntax, we can say actually what's visible from a hold lounge. For example, if you're looking at your concessions and saying we're not hitting the non-aeronautical revenue numbers we should be hitting, then you can look at your spatial syntax and see, well, nobody has visibility to all of these concessions, and people won't go to those spaces if they can't see them. That's just a natural behavior that we've noticed. So we take all that secondary data and the primary data. We also did a environmental quality scan using sensors. So we got over 5,000 data points in light quality, sound quality, scent quality, CO2 levels.
How do you measure these things?
We have sensors that we put up throughout both terminals at Ontario and tried to really understand what was causing some of the changes, like what's causing the noise level changes, what's causing the CO2 level changes. In fact, in some cases, we found that certain spaces throughout the terminals were above 50% of the time, they were above 70 decibel levels. So that means that it's an it's an uncomfortable noise level for users. And that's 50% of the day when we're tracking all day. We also found that there were several locations throughout the airport that were above, like 70% of the day, they were above comfortable CO2 levels, which can change your ability to make decisions, can change your fatigue levels. And so really we can start to think about what are solutions to get rid of CO2 in those areas.
I have to ask, how do you measure smell?
Measuring smell is difficult because it is so subjective. So we do a round of asking questions to people, what are you smelling in this area? If they're smelling garbage, like that's not good. But a lot of times they're smelling concessions food. And then we can also, we have a sentograph that helps us kind of determine, what smells should be there to enhance the space.
So you're collecting primary data, secondary data, and then environmental, sensorial data points, right? And then what do you do with all of this?
So we go through a process where we kind of overlay all of those and we try to analyze them against who the passengers are. So at this point, we have developed who the passenger profile is, what types of passengers are going through this terminal. And we go through every different touch point in the airport and we label those touch points with what were their specific comments, what were their specific behaviors, what were the needs that weren't being met in those spaces, and then what are the CO2 levels, temperature levels, lighting levels. How are the lighting levels causing glare, for instance, for passengers with reduced mobility who see glare on the floor and think, oh, that's a wet space. So we go through every single touch point. We layer all of the data that we've gathered, both qualitative and quantitative, and then we start making recommendations for the future. And when we make those recommendations, we put those into a framework that we call the Now, Next, Future. So what are things that they can do now to change and elevate that passenger experience? What are the things that they can do next if they have a little bit more agency to change the space? Maybe maybe add some furniture or, larger interior renovations. And then what do we think about they can do for the future? And that really means, full-fledged new construction. And that's where we get into our trend reporting, where we are pulling different trends and working with the airport themselves to understand how do they implement autonomous bag drops? How do they implement biometrics? Those larger items that take a lot more thought and processing.
So, data when it comes to architecture and design is not necessarily a totally new topic, right? In fact, people have been talking about all the data that you can collect, and it almost seems like an endless amount of data that you can, everything from like how often are people booking conference rooms? Is that conference room actually occupied? Where do people hang out? I mean, even sustainability measures can be measured through these data points. So how do you, I would imagine that you have to kind of distill some of like what's relevant data and what's not. How do you decide what to measure, like that you even should measure the lighting quality or the smell quality? How do you curate the data points when you have such an endless amount of data to choose from?
Well, I think it's easy. Well, what makes it a little bit easier is we had a 2-week time crunch. So we had to gather all of this data in 2 weeks, all the primary data, because we wanted to be on site. So we kind of looked at, how can we break up this schedule and what's feasible? We had to source participants to walk through the terminal. When can we schedule them? So there are a lot of bumpers that you can kind of put into place to kind of narrow down. But specifically when we're looking at things like lighting levels, noise levels, temperature levels, CO2 levels, those are things that we have kind of identified as non-negotiables for people. Those are things that make people either feel satisfied and comfortable in a space or dissatisfied and anxious and stressed and uncomfortable in a space.
Yeah.
And so we really want to make sure that our spaces are doing great on all those levels.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying. Well, what is the purpose of this exercise to begin with, right? So if it's to shape the user experience, it's to give passengers a more comfortable, more seamless, more human journey, then that's kind of what you have to measure, right? And so I would imagine that your goal, you have to define your goal and your purpose well in the first place. How do you even work with the client to say, okay, well, what is it that what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's interesting because when you enter that conversation between you as an architect and the client as an airport owner and operator, you also have a third perspective, which is the user. So you have to consider all three perspectives when you're setting those goals. Me as an architect, I come in with goals of how might the data influence design changes? The airport owner and operator has goals of how can I make my concessions or how can I make my whole lounges more successful to the users? And then also what's working with my staff? How do I create a one airport? Because even though TSA is a different entity, some people will relate that back to the airport and say that they had a negative experience because of TSA. And nobody really thinks that the concessionaires aren't a part of the airport ecosystem. So on the client side, it's really, they want to understand what's working, what's not working across the entire ecosystem, and how can they elevate that experience. And then from the user side, they want, everything to be seamless and to be easy and to be understandable. And from their side, they're not really going to complain about something unless it's not working.
Yeah.
And they're really not going to be asking for something super futuristic like technology or anything unless they see it, unless they're attracted to it, or unless, in our case, we have a lot of people that are traveling from larger airports like Seattle, Dallas, New York to Ontario. So their home airports have a lot of amenities and upgrades and things that are accessible to them, whereas Ontario doesn't. So making sure that we're meeting those basic needs for the user is extremely important. So that's how we kind of start setting our goals.
Yeah. Earlier, I think we were talking about how the airport goes, okay, well, we need to, maybe not even just Ontario, airports generally go, hey, we want to create a better passenger experience. We should get more comfortable seats. We should get more outlets. And this happens not even just in design. So often we tend to lead with the solution and go, this must be the solution, right? Or this must be the problem. And I think the gift that data gives us is to kind of make things a little bit more objective and to kind of remove these sort of personal perspectives, which are valuable, right? Mm-hmm. We do ask passengers, what is it that you want? But it helps us to get away from, let's just lead with the solution. Let's lead with what the architect might want. Let's lead with what the airport might even want, to really drill down into what does the data tell us. Mm-hmm. But you have to define the problem correctly in the first place. And so how do you kind of apply this to different typologies, right? Because that sort of leading with the solution or defining the problem, so often we're trying to create a better experience, whether it's for patients or for students or for the employee. How do you help clients across other typologies figure out what their problem is and use data correctly?
Well, I think it's interesting because clients will come to you with a specific problem most times. And through this process, we actually find areas that could use enhancement or, could elevate the user experience that maybe they weren't aware of, that they find extremely important. And that's the other thing too. We may find 10 different areas that need improvement, but we actually also go through a prioritization workshop with them to say, okay, these are the problems or the areas that we kind of identified as needing improvements, and let's prioritize those with your goals so that we're never suggesting suggesting that they just make investments based off of just the data or just our preferences, but they're also making them based off of their personal goals. And so with other typologies, some of the things that we've, done in the past and some of the things that we're doing in the future in healthcare, healthcare is a very complex typology. When you are stressed to the nines and you're like running in with your baby maybe who's had seizures and you need someone's help, you need to find that ER and you need to find that desk.
There's so many similarities when you really think about healthcare spaces and aviation, though, right? Like people
it's all
are
process-driven.
Right. Process-driven. People are stressed. And then also going back to everyone has to go to the hospital at some point, sometimes for great reasons and sometimes for really scary ones. Everyone goes to an airport. And again, not everyone speaks the same language. Not everyone has the same ability level physically. And it's already naturally a very stressful place to be in.
Well, and in one situation in a healthcare facility, we used the retina scanning glasses. And we found out that one of our users, our goal was to have them find the right elevator. So in this particular instance, the elevators were color-coded. And our user, who had never been to this hospital before, said, well, I'm actually colorblind. So is there another way I can find this elevator? And that's when you realize, you have to layer information as a part of the wayfinding experience, but as a way to, alleviate some of that anxiety in those complex situations. In our education study that we will be doing, one of the problems that the client said to us is the building that we are in is designed so well that it actually intimidates students. So they walk in the door and they turn right back around and decide not to come to school at this higher education.
Because they're overwhelmed.
Because they're overwhelmed. They think, and this is something that we're going to find out through interviews. What do they think? What about that space makes them want to turn around and not come to school? But the client's hypothesis is that they think it's too intimidating and that they may not be able to succeed. And so how can we as designers build success in from that first view?
Yeah, I love that you call it a hypothesis, right? All of this data and experimentation, surveys, and really kind of proving the value of design and not necessarily coming in with the assumption, right? Because it could be that someone's just feeling very intimidated by a space. But, probably that space was designed in that way, because it was, hey, we want it to look sort of elevated, or we want this sort of great established look, because again, someone made the assumption that would attract students there.
Higher education.
That's higher education. That must be what people want when they're paying their tuition. And again, it goes back to making these assumptions, but not because someone thinks a certain thing, or maybe even a small group of people think a certain thing. And so I think that's again, that gift that data gives you. And so you're working with this client to kind of ask, why are people turning around? Now, is there data that shows that they're leaving as soon as they walk in?
So they have their own data. We haven't actually started that project yet, but they have their own data, and it is overwhelming how many students will go in for the first day and will turn around and leave. And this is higher education. You would think at that age, it's a little bit different. But at that age, and for this specific facility, they are likely paying their own tuition. They likely are much more responsible for the success and the outcome of their education. And therefore, if they walk in and they don't feel like they can be successful at this institution, then they feel like they may be able to find success in another way.
So you've collected some of the demographics for the higher ed campus in terms of understanding what kind of students are using the facility and maybe why they're turning around. What's next in terms of the kind of data you're going to have to uncover for this particular client?
Well, so we'll do very similar data collection as to what we did for Ontario. We'll start with that secondary data. We'll look at everything that they have, and we'll look at everything that we can find that's relevant or studies that have been conducted. That'll actually help us kind of tailor which data that we actually need to fill in the gaps for us. We will do probably 100 plus interviews of students, asking them about the space, just, describing the space to us or describing their experience. But we'll also do a lot of the behavior mapping, the shadowing. We'll do the retina scanning. We'll also do a lot of the the environmental quality sensors as well to really help us determine all aspects of that space. And then we'll start looking at more psychological design practices to really help us determine, how do you design a space that emanates success without it overwhelming users? Because that's the problem here, is that this building is designed so nicely that people probably thought these high finishes, these high quality stone finishes mean success, when really to people who are, coming from the demographics that we're seeing that are responsible for paying their tuition, they need to know that they're going to get a return on that investment.
Right. Or maybe it feels great and established and shiny, but maybe it doesn't feel personal enough, right? So how do you create that? I think that you bring up a really good point. Data is so useful, and you can collect all of these numbers and fixation points and all of that, but you do have to kind of layer this sort of human element and the design that architects bring, right? You can't just plug in these numbers someplace and have someone spit out a design.
Right.
Because there is the psychology of how we interact with spaces and how the built environment shapes that sort of perceived thing. Someone once told me there are materials, for instance, in healthcare spaces that are actually clean.
Yeah.
But then there's real cleanliness, and then there's perceived cleanliness, right? Speckled countertops, for instance, make people not feel like something is clean.
Right.
And so, or like the psychology of how do we establish trust, or how do we establish sort of transparency? We talk about that a lot in the office space. But what is the psychology of feeling included in something or belonging? So what sort of psychology sort of exercises or subjects are you going to be studying for this higher ed client?
There are a lot of different works that we've been looking at where psychology of inclusion, groups of 8, for example, people will talk to each other in groups of 8, but once you get to 9, everybody kind of breaks out into their own group. So when you start to think about space and spatial design, when it's designed for those peak times, airports, hospitals, education facilities, they're designed to hold, 100, 200 people at a time. In airports, it's a lot more. But then whenever it comes down to those groups of 8, that it doesn't support that conversation. We also know the lighting levels support inclusive conversations. Different lighting levels can change the way that you socialize, or different scents can also change the way that you feel about the space, whether it's warm, whether it's cold, whether it's inclusive, whether it's distracting. You can also make a space feel clean by infusing it with grapefruit or orange peel. People will think that it's being cleaned all the time. Which is just interesting. You can use a lot of the data points that we're gathering. You can use those as design metrics and design tools to help really shape a space.
Yeah, I think that's like where that magic happens, right? You take the numbers, you know how a space might be performing currently, but then you also know the psychology of where people do their best. Right. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the process and how you're applying it to these two different typologies. We started talking about this a little bit. What do you think's next for data and how you might apply it to the built environment for airports or education, or for really any kind of building?
I mean, that's a great question. A lot of we do some trend reporting, really looking at, what technologies are increasing or accelerating, and how are users adopting those technologies, or how are they behaving once they use those technologies. That type of research is extremely important for us, especially in aviation, because the last thing we want to do is make everything biometric, and then people don't trust biometrics, so therefore they don't fly on planes anymore, which will not be the case. Actually, we're seeing great user behavior and user adoption with biometrics right now, so it's actually going in the opposite direction. But I think the way that we gather and use data, something that we'll have to do in the future is, make sure that we're using it appropriately. Make sure, right now, one of the things that we are doing is making sure that all of the data that we gather is unbiased. And a lot of times, especially when we're looking at demographics of who's using the airport, we have to make sure that we're using specific data sets, for example, to make sure that we're not excluding different parts of the community who have recently started flying. Historical data can be a little bit more biased. So, when we're using that and translating it to, say, some sort of machine learning or AI, then we'll need to make sure that we're translating it in a way that is acceptable.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point, right? Because I would imagine that companies can pull up a survey and run customer surveys, and you get them all the time, like, hey, you came to our gym, can you review the class and all of that? But there's so much bias that's built into this, right? Maybe I respond because I actually have access to my technology, or I'm more likely to take to an iPhone survey than maybe another user would. But when a client comes to you saying, hey, we've heard all of this great stuff about data, or maybe they're not coming to you and they're thinking about doing this on their own, what are some major sort of considerations that you might tell a client to think about in terms of, hey, how do you avoid biases? How do you shape the right questions? How do you collect the right data? What are some sort of things that you should keep in mind?
Specifically for the client?
When you are thinking about doing a sort of similar exercise, is it timing? Is there a certain kind of data that's more telling than another kind?
I don't know if there's you can find reasoning and insight from a lot of different data. And I think that making sure that insight is not your own perspective is extremely important, because you could read a data set and I could read a data set and we could interpret it completely differently. What we have to do is make sure that interpretation is not just in the benefit of the client, but is serving the client in a way that they are understanding where they're making successful moves and where they're where they're failing. And that's just extremely important. We could just, tell them where they're being successful and then continue working for them, but we have to, let the data show them where they can make improvements. I also think that it's extremely important to make sure that when we are going through and gathering information, obviously I'm a huge proponent of talking to people, interviewing people, getting surveys from people, and we always make sure that we're getting the right demographic. So, in one project that we're working on right now, we're looking at lower income communities. So we are talking to people in those communities, and if they do or don't have access to the technology, we're still finding ways to reach out to them. So I think that it's important to know who you're designing for in order to make the space successful.
Yeah. So lots of information that data can give you, and it's been in the conversation in terms of how it affects the built environment for a while. What's the most, and maybe we'll end on this question, what's the most interesting thing that working with data has taught you? You get the benefit of probing and investigating all the new technologies that are out there, asking all the tough questions and investigating new typologies. But what's something that the data has taught you?
I'll use this project with Ontario as a great example. As an aviation designer, prior to Hugo, I was an aviation designer. And one of the things I loved to design in were planters or, small gardens for people to enjoy, or, trees. And our clients would always be like, no, take that out. Too much maintenance, or trees invite birds, or, so it was always a no to plants. But with Ontario, one of the things that we were able to prove in our data was that there are elevated CO2 levels in specific areas where if you introduce a green wall or a planter or a tree, that you can reduce the CO2 levels to a specific amount that allows people to still have their decision-making capabilities. In some cases, and this is so crazy, at Ontario, before you get up into the security level, you have to actually go up an escalator. So the people at the bottom can't see security, so they think it's taking a long time, so they're extremely anxious. And then so many people fall off the escalators. It's insane. We noticed it in our studies. We asked the client, oh yeah, 3 a day, 4 a day, 5 a day. That's not, that's so many people
tumble down the escalator.
And a lot of what we observed is that there are people with vertigo. We know that people with vertigo, going up an escalator, actually putting trees next to the escalator will help stabilize them. And then also there are people who are using their cell phones and forget to step off the escalator, and that causes them to fall. I don't know if trees will help them, but the point that I'm making is that there are very specific ways to use data to help us understand, in this particular instance, where we can introduce plants, where we can introduce nature, where we can introduce nature sounds, for example. We did that study on the sound quality and the noise quality in the terminal. And what we found is that in some cases, introducing bird sounds can actually reduce the stress and anxiety of passengers, especially as they're coming out of TSA, because that is the highest noise level. It's 95 decibels for 92% of the day. So it's extremely loud. And we, can't even imagine, once you go from that to the concourse, the level change in noise. Adding those bird sounds will help to reduce the adrenaline, to lower your anxiety and your stress levels, and really get you, ready to board your plane.
I love that. Our lives and the way we move through spaces is changing all the time. Whether it's TSA or, what the workplace looks like, all of it's changing all the time. And I love that data has this power to either challenge traditional best practices, we've always done it this way, or trees are too costly to maintain, right? To challenge it, but then also sometimes to underscore some things that we just know are enduring good best practices. Biophilia, good daylighting. Mm-hmm. So I love that we're moving away from assumption to really concrete data that constantly reevaluates that built environment.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Samantha. It's been great chatting with you.
It's been a great chat.
Lots to learn about data for all of us as architects and designers, but even folks who just kind of enjoy talking about design. So thank you so much for sharing.
Of course.
And thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you the next time on The Square.